I sat in a silent legal office on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after burying my mother, expecting what I'd been told would be a routine reading of her will. I remember the attorney's assistant offering me coffee I never drank, the specific hum of the building's air conditioning, the particular, sterile calm of a room built for exactly this kind of moment. Then the attorney reached the final page, and read a name I didn't recognize. My mother's estate, her house, her savings, the modest but meaningful life she'd spent 68 years building, had been left almost entirely to a woman named Renee Castellano, described in the document as my mother's companion and caregiver of the past 3 years. I received a single, specific bequest, a photo album. Nothing else. Not the house I'd grown up in. Not a single dollar of the savings my mother and father had built together over 4 decades of marriage before he passed. A photo album, and a name I'd heard maybe twice in 3 years, now sitting where my own name should have been. My name is Laura. I'm 51 years old, and for the past 8 months, I've been fighting to understand exactly how a woman my mother knew for 3 years ended up with everything, while I, her only child, ended up with a stranger's name where my inheritance used to be. This is the story of how that happened, what I found once I started looking closely at the last 3 years of my mother's life, and the disturbing pattern I eventually discovered wasn't unique to our family at all. That I need to tell you about my mother before I tell you about Renee, because understanding who she'd been for most of her life is essential to understanding how completely her final years diverged from everything that came before them. My mother, Margaret, was a retired elementary school teacher, sharp, opinionated, and fiercely independent for the vast majority of her 71 years. My father passed away when I was 32, and my mother, rather than collapsing under that loss the way some might have expected, spent the following decade building an active, full life on her own terms, a bridge club she'd played in for over 15 years, a standing weekly lunch with 3 close friends from her teaching days, a genuinely warm, easy relationship with me and my own 2 children, her only grandchildren. I lived 40 minutes from her for most of that decade, close enough that we saw each other regularly without living in each other's pockets, Sunday dinners most weeks, phone calls several times between, the ordinary, comfortable rhythm of a mother and adult daughter who genuinely liked spending time together, not simply out of obligation. My children adored her. She was, by every account I could give you, and by every account her longtime friends would confirm, an engaged, sharp, entirely present figure in all of our lives right up until the specific period that would eventually become the subject of an entire legal investigation. I remember, specifically, a conversation my mother and I had over dinner roughly a year before her fall, discussing, in the casual way families sometimes do, what would eventually happen to her house and savings whenever she eventually passed. She told me, without hesitation, that everything would come to me, that she'd already had a will drafted years earlier reflecting exactly that, and that she'd chosen, deliberately, not to complicate her estate with elaborate trusts or conditions, since she trusted me completely to handle whatever came my way responsibly. I remember that conversation feeling almost unnecessary at the time, a formality between 2 people who understood each other completely. I think about it constantly now, given everything that eventually happened to directly contradict it, the change, when I look back on it now with considerably more clarity than I had while it was actually happening, began roughly 3.5 years before her death, following a fall in her home that resulted in a fractured hip and a difficult, extended recovery. It was during that recovery, arranged initially through a reputable home care agency for what was meant to be temporary, short-term assistance, that Renee first entered my mother's life. I want to be honest that my initial impression of Renee, during those first several months, was entirely positive. She was attentive, patient, skilled at the practical demands of post-surgical elder care in a way that genuinely eased an enormously stressful period for both my mother and me. I remember feeling grateful, specifically, that my mother had someone competent and kind managing her daily care during a recovery I couldn't be present for as constantly as the situation required, given my own job and family responsibilities 40 minutes away, what I didn't recognize at the time, and what I've only been able to piece together clearly in hindsight, working backward through calendars, phone records, and the memories of my mother's closest friends, was that Renee's presence in my mother's life didn't simply continue past the point where it was medically necessary. It expanded, steadily, methodically, in ways that each individually seemed reasonable, and that collectively amounted to something considerably more troubling. The home care agency's involvement ended roughly 4 months after my mother's hip had sufficiently healed, a transition Renee handled by proposing, directly to my mother rather than through the agency, that she continue working privately as a full-time companion, citing a genuine, apparently sincere fondness she developed for my mother during the recovery period. My mother agreed enthusiastically, and I remember supporting that decision myself at the time, since Renee had been, by every visible measure, an excellent, trustworthy presence during a difficult period. Over the following 2 years, the frequency of my own visits to my mother's home began to decrease, gradually, in a pattern I didn't fully register as a pattern until I was looking back at it as evidence. It started with small, individually reasonable redirections, Renee suggesting, kindly, that my mother needed rest rather than visitors on days I'd normally have come by, mentioning a doctor's appointment that made a planned Sunday dinner inconvenient, gently proposing that large family gatherings, with my children's noise and energy, might be overstimulating for my mother during what Renee described as a naturally fluctuating recovery from the trauma of her fall and hip surgery. I want to be honest that I didn't push back against most of these redirections at the time, because each one, individually, sounded like exactly the kind of reasonable, caring precaution a good caregiver would raise. It was only in hindsight, laying out 18 months of these small redirections end to end, that the pattern became impossible to ignore, a slow, steady narrowing of my own access to my mother, engineered so gradually and so plausibly that I never once, while it was actually happening, felt I had legitimate grounds to object. By the final year of my mother's life, my visits had narrowed from weekly to, at most, once or twice a month, always arranged in advance through Renee rather than directly with my mother, always framed around my mother's specific medical needs or energy levels on any given day. I remember calling my mother's cell phone directly during this period and reaching Renee more often than my mother herself, who Renee explained was resting, or in another room, or simply not immediately available, explanations that felt, individually, entirely reasonable for an elderly woman managing declining health, and that only later, viewed together, revealed themselves as a systematic barrier between my mother and me. There's one specific afternoon from that final year I've returned to more than any other memory from that entire period, because it's the moment I can now identify with the benefit of hindsight, as the clearest single instance of the pattern I wouldn't fully understand until much later. I'd driven to my mother's house unannounced, on a Sunday, something I rarely did but had decided to do that particular week simply because I'd missed her and happened to have a free afternoon. Renee met me at the door before I'd even reached the porch, explaining, warmly but firmly, that my mother was having a difficult day, and that visitors, even family, tended to be overwhelming during these specific episodes. I remember standing on that porch, genuinely uncertain whether pushing past that explanation would be an act of appropriate concern or an intrusive violation of my mother's own stated wishes, as relayed through someone I still, at that point, considered a trustworthy caregiver. I left that day without seeing my mother at all, and I remember calling her that evening, once Renee's shift had presumably ended, reaching my mother directly and finding her entirely lucid, entirely herself, with no memory of having had any kind of difficult day that would have warranted turning away a visit from her own daughter. I asked her about it, gently, and she seemed genuinely confused by the question, suggesting, vaguely, that perhaps Renee had simply been overly cautious that particular afternoon. I let it go, the way I let go of dozens of similarly small, individually explainable moments across those 2 years, because in isolation, none of them felt like sufficient grounds to fundamentally distrust someone my mother clearly valued and depended on. I've since counted, going back through my own calendar and phone records as part of Diane's case-building process, at least 11 similar incidents across those final 2 years, visits cut short, phone calls redirected, plans quietly rescheduled at the last minute, each one, on its own, entirely forgettable, and each one, together, forming a pattern so gradual that I never once, while actually living through it, felt the specific alarm that seeing all 11 listed together on a single page eventually produced. The first genuine crack in my understanding of what was happening came roughly 8 months before my mother's death, during a phone call that felt, at the time, simply confusing rather than alarming. My mother mentioned, in passing, a recent trip she and Renee had taken together to visit what she described as Renee's family, a weekend excursion to a city roughly 3 hours away that my mother spoke about with genuine warmth, describing a pleasant dinner, comfortable accommodations, a sense of being genuinely welcomed by people she'd never previously mentioned to me at all. I remember feeling a small, specific unease at that detail, not because there was anything inherently wrong with my mother building new relationships and taking trips in her final years, but because I had absolutely no prior knowledge that Renee even had family in that particular city, despite years of at least occasional conversation about Renee's own life during the time she'd spent in our home. I mentioned this trip, some weeks later, to one of my mother's longtime friends from her bridge club, largely making conversation rather than investigating anything, and received a response that unsettled me considerably more than I expected. My mother's friend told me she'd also heard about this same trip, but had heard it described somewhat differently, as a visit not to Renee's family, but to an elder law attorney's office, in that same city, a detail my mother had apparently mentioned to her friend but not, for reasons I didn't understand at the time, to me. I didn't act on that discrepancy immediately, largely because I told myself, at the time, that there were plenty of mundane explanations. Perhaps my mother had simply misremembered or conflated the details of a busy weekend. Perhaps her friend had misunderstood something my mother mentioned in passing. It was only months later, going through documents during the estate process, that I found confirmation of exactly what my mother's friend had actually heard correctly: a signed engagement letter, dated the same weekend as that trip, retaining a specific elder law attorney to draft a new will that I've already described the broad shape of that afternoon in the attorney's office, but I want to walk through it in more detail now, because the specific mechanics of what that will actually contain matter enormously to understanding the scope of what had happened during those final 3 years. The will itself had been executed just over 14 months before my mother's death, replacing a previous will, one I'd actually seen years earlier, drafted shortly after my father's passing, that left everything, straightforwardly, to me. This new will left the entirety of my mother's estate, including the family home my father and mother had purchased together nearly 40 years earlier, to Renee, with a single, specific exception: a photo album, itemized by name in the document itself, left to me. I remember sitting in that office trying to process not just the financial reality of what I'd just heard, but the specific, deliberate quality of that single bequest. It wasn't an oversight. Someone had sat down, at some point during the drafting of this document, and specifically decided that of everything my mother owned, the one item that should come to me was a photo album, a decision that felt, and still feels, like a message I've spent months trying to fully understand the intended meaning of. The attorney handling the reading, a different attorney than the one who drafted the will itself, was unable to answer most of my immediate questions about the circumstances surrounding the document's creation, information that would require formally requesting the drafting attorney's own file, a process I initiated within the week, retaining my own attorney, a careful, experienced estate litigator named Diane Okafor, to help me understand exactly what legal options, if any, existed for challenging a will under these circumstances. Diane explained something to me in our first consultation that reframed the entire legal shape of what I was potentially dealing with, moving the conversation from a purely emotional register into a specific, actionable legal framework. She explained that wills can be legally contested on several specific grounds, and that the pattern I described to her, a gradual isolation from family, a dramatic, late-in-life change to estate planning documents, a caregiver relationship that had expanded well beyond its original scope, fit a well-documented legal category known as undue influence, a doctrine that allows a will to be invalidated if it can be shown that the person who benefited from it exerted improper pressure on the testator, exploiting a position of trust or dependency to substitute their own wishes for the genuine intentions of the person making the will. Diane was careful to explain that proving undue influence is genuinely difficult, requiring more than simply showing that a caregiver benefited from a will change, since caregivers legitimately do sometimes receive genuine, freely given gifts from people they've cared for with real affection. What courts typically look for, she explained, is a specific cluster of factors: a relationship of trust and dependency, evidence of isolation from other family members and support systems, involvement by the beneficiary in arranging or facilitating the new estate planning documents, and a resulting will that departs dramatically and suspiciously from the testator's previously established intentions and relationships. Every single one of those factors, Diane pointed out as we worked through my mother's case together, appeared to be present in what I described. A caregiver relationship that had grown from professional to deeply, unusually dependent. A documented, gradual isolation from me and from my mother's own long-standing friendships. Renee's own presence during the trip to retain the elder law attorney who drafted the new will. And a final document that reversed, entirely, an estate plan my mother had maintained consistently for the better part of 2 decades prior. Diane also explained something else that reframed how I understood the entire timeline, that undue influence cases often hinge significantly on the testator's cognitive and emotional vulnerability at the specific moment the new document was created, rather than simply their general capacity at some earlier or later point. This meant, she explained, that establishing the precise state of my mother's cognitive health during the specific weeks surrounding that trip to the elder law attorney's office would likely become one of the single most important threads of our entire case, more important, in some ways, than any individual piece of evidence about Renee's own behavior. She also cautioned me, gently but directly, that pursuing this kind of case is rarely quick and rarely straightforward, even when the underlying facts seem, from the outside, relatively clear. Probate litigation, she explained, often takes well over a year to resolve, involves extensive discovery into deeply personal medical and financial records, and requires the contesting party, in this case, me, to essentially relive and re-examine the most painful period of a parent's final years in forensic, unemotional detail, in service of proving a case that even strong evidence doesn't guarantee will succeed. Diane also walked me through why courts weigh isolation so heavily in these cases specifically, a point I found genuinely clarifying. She explained that undue influence doctrine exists precisely because the clearest evidence of manipulation, the actual conversations, the specific words used to shape someone's thinking, almost never survives in any documented form. Influence of this kind happens in private, incrementally, without witnesses or paper trails. Courts have therefore learned, over decades of similar cases, to treat isolation itself as a kind of proxy evidence, since a caregiver who genuinely has nothing to hide rarely has strong incentive to systematically narrow a vulnerable person's access to their other trusted relationships. The isolation, in other words, isn't just a symptom of what happened. In the eyes of the law, it's often the single clearest piece of evidence that something happened at all. What followed was months of methodical, often exhausting work, gathering documentation that would allow Diane to formally file a will contest in probate court, a process considerably more involved than I'd initially understood before beginning it. We requested and obtained the drafting attorney's complete file, which included, among other things, contemporaneous notes from the initial consultation, notes that, Diane pointed out with evident professional concern, documented surprisingly little independent assessment of my mother's cognitive state or the voluntariness of her decision-making, given the significant departure this new will represented from her prior estate plan. We also obtained my mother's complete medical records from the final 3 years of her life, which revealed something I hadn't previously known in full clinical detail, a formal diagnosis, roughly 18 months before her death, of mild cognitive impairment, a condition that, while not equivalent to a full determination of incapacity, Diane explained was highly relevant to any assessment of her vulnerability to influence during the specific period the new will was drafted that we subpoenaed. Phone records for both my mother's cell phone and Renee's, establishing, with considerably more precision than my own fragmented memory could have provided, the actual documented decline in contact between my mother and me across those final 2 years, alongside a corresponding, steady increase in Renee's own involvement in virtually every aspect of my mother's daily life, financial management included. That financial detail proved particularly significant. Diane's review of my mother's bank records revealed that Renee had been added as an authorized signer on my mother's checking account roughly 6 months before the new will was executed, and that several transfers, individually modest but collectively substantial, had moved from my mother's accounts into an account in Renee's name during that same general period. Transfers Diane described as potentially forming the basis of a separate financial elder abuse claim, entirely apart from the will contest itself. Diane's forensic accountant, brought in specifically to trace the full financial picture, found a pattern within those transfers that took considerable time to fully piece together. Rather than large, obviously suspicious withdrawals that might have triggered scrutiny from the bank's own fraud monitoring systems, the transfers had been structured as a series of smaller, recurring amounts, framed in my mother's own account notes, in her handwriting on the physical check stub she still occasionally used, as payments for extra care services, or household expenses, categories vague enough to be entirely unremarkable individually, but that, added together across nearly 2 years, amounted to a sum considerably beyond what any reasonable accounting of Renee's actual caregiving compensation would have justified. I also learned, during this phase of the investigation, that my mother's homeowner's insurance policy and the deed to her house itself had been quietly amended roughly 4 months before her death, adding Renee as a named party with a right of survivorship on a small detached guest cottage on the property, a structure my mother had once, years earlier, mentioned renting out for modest supplemental income. Diane flagged this specific document as particularly significant, since property transfers of this kind, executed outside the formal will process itself, are sometimes used deliberately to move assets beyond the reach of an eventual will contest, since they technically transfer during the person's lifetime rather than through the estate itself. One piece of evidence Diane and I spent considerable time working through deserves its own explanation, because it ended up becoming one of the more persuasive elements of our entire case: the specific medical notes from my mother's primary care physician, a doctor she'd seen for over 15 years, spanning the exact period surrounding both her mild cognitive impairment diagnosis and the drafting of the new will. Diane arranged for an independent geriatric psychiatrist to review those complete records as an expert witness, someone with no prior connection to our case, tasked simply with offering a professional opinion on what my mother's documented cognitive state likely meant for her vulnerability to influence during that specific window. The expert's written report concluded that while my mother's diagnosis didn't rise to the level of full incapacity, mild cognitive impairment of the type and severity documented in her chart is specifically associated, in the clinical literature, with increased susceptibility to social influence and difficulty maintaining consistent, independent judgment under sustained pressure from a trusted figure, precisely the vulnerability profile. The expert noted that undue influence doctrine exists to protect against. That expert opinion mattered enormously, Diane explained, because it moved our case beyond simply arguing that Renee's behavior seemed suspicious, into a more clinically grounded argument that my mother's specific, documented cognitive state made her measurably more vulnerable to exactly the kind of sustained, patient manipulation the evidence suggested she'd experienced. I remember reading that expert report for the first time and feeling a strange, mixed emotion, a kind of vindication, finally seeing my own instincts about those final years given genuine clinical weight, alongside a fresh wave of grief at seeing my mother's vulnerability described so clinically, reduced to a diagnostic category in a legal document. The piece of this investigation that changed its entire scope, however, came from a source Diane's own investigator uncovered almost incidentally, while conducting standard background verification on Renee as part of preparing our case, a detail that reframed this from an isolated, one-time situation into something considerably more troubling. Renee, it turned out, had a prior employment history as a private caregiver for an elderly client roughly 7 years before she began working for my mother, a woman named Harold Whitfield, whose family, Diane's investigator discovered through public probate records, had also unsuccessfully contested a late life will change that left the bulk of Harold's estate to Renee rather than to his own 2 adult children. I want to describe the specific, sinking recognition I felt learning this detail, because it reframed everything I'd been struggling to understand about my own mother's situation. This wasn't a singular, unfortunate circumstance where one caregiver had happened to develop an inappropriate, exploitative relationship with one vulnerable client. This was, apparently, a pattern, one that had already played out once before, with a different family, using what appeared to be a remarkably similar structure of gradual isolation, escalating financial involvement, and a dramatic late life will change. Diane reached out to Harold Whitfield's surviving daughter, a woman named Patricia Whitfield Moore, who agreed to speak with us and, ultimately, to provide testimony about her own family's experience. Patricia described a pattern that felt, listening to her account, almost identical to my own, a caregiver relationship that began through legitimate, agency-arranged care following a medical crisis, that gradually expanded into full-time private employment, accompanied by a steady, difficult-to-pinpoint narrowing of her own access to her father, culminating in a will change that left her with a single, specific token bequest while the bulk of her father's estate went to Renee. Patricia told me her own family's contest of that earlier will had ultimately failed, largely, she believed in hindsight, because they hadn't had access to the kind of comprehensive medical and financial documentation Diane had since helped me assemble, and because, at the time, they hadn't understood undue influence as a distinct, provable legal theory in the way our own case was now being built around. She told me she'd carried a specific, unresolved grief over that failed contest for years, a grief compounded by watching, from a distance, as Renee moved on to what Patricia now understood was very likely a repeat of the exact same pattern with an entirely new family. Before the deposition, I asked to meet Patricia Whitfield Moore in person, and we agreed on a quiet coffee shop roughly midway between our two cities, a meeting that ended up lasting nearly 3 hours, far longer than either of us had originally planned. Sitting across from her, I was struck immediately by how many small, specific details of her account mirrored my own experience with an almost eerie precision. She described her father's own gradual withdrawal from their previously close relationship in language nearly identical to what I would have used to describe my mother's, the same pattern of reasonable-sounding redirections, the same slow narrowing from weekly visits to occasional, prearranged ones, the same specific confusion of reaching a caregiver on the phone more often than the parent herself. Patricia told me something that has stayed with me since, describing the specific, isolating grief of having pursued a will contest years earlier that ultimately failed, watching, from a distance she'd never fully recovered from, as her father's estate passed to a woman she'd always suspected but had never been able to definitively prove had manipulated him. She said the hardest part of those intervening years hadn't been the financial loss itself, but the specific, unresolved doubt about whether her father's final feelings toward her had genuinely changed, or whether they'd been shaped by someone else entirely during a period when he was no longer capable of fully protecting his own judgment. Hearing her describe that exact doubt, one I'd been carrying myself for months without fully articulating it even to my own husband, was one of the more validating, if devastating, moments of this entire process. We agreed, before that first meeting ended, to share whatever documentation each of our respective legal teams could appropriately exchange, recognizing, even in that first conversation, that our two cases, considered together, were likely to be considerably stronger than either pursued in isolation. Renee's deposition, conducted as part of our case's discovery process, proved to be one of the more revealing and disturbing experiences of the entire ordeal. Under careful, methodical questioning from Diane, Renee's account of her relationship with my mother shifted considerably from the warm, uncomplicated companionship she'd initially described in her own filed response to our contest. She acknowledged, under direct questioning, having accompanied my mother to the initial consultation with the elder law attorney who drafted the new will, though she maintained throughout that she had done so purely at my mother's own request, and had not influenced the substance of what my mother ultimately decided to include in the document. She acknowledged being added as an authorized signer on my mother's accounts, framing this, similarly, as a practical necessity for managing my mother's day-to-day expenses rather than any form of financial exploitation. What proved most significant, however, was Diane's careful questioning about Renee's prior employment with Harold Whitfield, a line of inquiry Renee's own attorney objected to repeatedly on relevance grounds, objections the presiding judge ultimately allowed Diane to pursue given the clear pattern evidence such testimony could potentially establish. Renee's answers regarding that earlier situation were markedly more evasive than her responses regarding my mother's case, repeatedly characterizing the Whitfield family's prior contest as having been resolved amicably, and declining, on the advice of her own counsel, to elaborate further on the specific circumstances of how she'd come to be the primary beneficiary of that earlier estate as well. I watched that deposition from across the same conference table Renee had once, according to my mother's own account, described as feeling like family during those final years of increasing isolation from me, and I felt, more than anything else, an exhausted, sober recognition of exactly how methodically and repeatedly this specific pattern had apparently been executed, against at least two vulnerable, elderly people, years apart, with what appeared to be genuine, refined skill at avoiding the kind of clear, unambiguous evidence that would make either case simple to prove. Alongside Renee's deposition, Diane also deposed the elder law attorney who had originally drafted my mother's final will, a woman named Carol Jennings, whose own account added an important, if unintentional, piece to our overall case. Carol testified that she recalled meeting with my mother on 2 occasions before finalizing the document, an initial consultation and a signing appointment roughly 2 weeks later, and confirmed, under questioning, that Renee had been present in the waiting area, though not in the room itself, during both meetings, having driven my mother to the appointments given her limited mobility following the hip injury years earlier. Carol maintained that she had followed her standard practice of meeting alone with my mother to assess her stated wishes, and that she had no specific reason, at the time, to suspect any external influence on the decisions my mother communicated to her directly. Under Diane's more pointed questioning, however, Carol acknowledged that her standard intake process for elderly clients at that time did not include any formalized, structured assessment of cognitive capacity beyond a general, conversational impression, and that she had not been made aware, during either meeting, of my mother's recent mild cognitive impairment diagnosis, information my mother herself may not have volunteered, and information Renee, present in the waiting room during both visits, would very likely have known and did not disclose to Carol despite driving my mother to both appointments. Diane later described this specific gap, a caregiver's silence about a diagnosis directly relevant to the very capacity assessment an estate attorney is supposed to informally perform, as one of the clearest, if quietest, pieces of evidence suggesting deliberate, structured facilitation of the will's creation, rather than the neutral, incidental involvement Renee's own testimony had characterized it as. The case ultimately resolved through a negotiated settlement rather than proceeding to a full trial, a decision Diane and I discussed at considerable length before I agreed to it. The combined weight of the medical records documenting my mother's cognitive decline, the phone and financial records establishing both the pattern of isolation and Renee's escalating financial involvement, and, critically, the pattern evidence from the Whitfield case, created, in Diane's professional assessment, a settlement leverage considerably stronger than either family had possessed pursuing these claims individually. The settlement resulted in the will being set aside, with my mother's estate ultimately distributed according to her prior long-standing estate plan, the one that had reflected, consistently, over 2 decades of her actual, freely made intentions before the isolation and influence of her final years had reshaped them. Renee retained a modest settlement amount, considerably smaller than what the contested will would have provided her. A compromise Diane explained was a realistic reflection of the genuine uncertainty and cost involved in any will contest, even one supported by evidence as strong as ours had ultimately become. I want to be honest that the financial resolution, while significant, was never the part of this process I found most meaningful. What mattered far more was the formal, legal acknowledgement that the will reflecting Renee as primary beneficiary did not, in fact, represent my mother's genuine, freely made wishes, a validation I needed, personally, far more than I needed the assets themselves, given how thoroughly the entire ordeal had made me question my own understanding of my mother's final years and her actual feelings toward me during them. Diane explained, once the settlement was finalized, that Renee had also agreed, as part of the negotiated terms, to a formal restriction preventing her from working as a paid caregiver for elderly clients in our state going forward, a provision Diane had pushed for specifically, drawing directly on the pattern evidence from the Whitfield case, arguing successfully that the settlement needed to address not just the financial harm already done, but the ongoing risk Renee's continued work in this field represented to other vulnerable people. I found a specific, if incomplete, comfort in that particular term, knowing that whatever else the settlement couldn't fully repair, it had at least closed off one avenue for this exact pattern to be repeated a third time. Patricia Whitfield Moore's own case, informed by the additional evidence our shared investigation had surfaced, was also able to be reopened through a separate legal, ultimately resulting in a more favorable outcome for her family than their initial, unsuccessful contest years earlier had achieved, a small, meaningful measure of justice delayed by years, but not, in the end, entirely denied that I haven't yet talked about what this process was like for my own 2 children, who had grown up adoring their grandmother and who experienced their own confused, painful version of that same gradual narrowing during her final 2 years, without any of us fully understanding, at the time, what was actually happening. My daughter, 24, asked me a question early in the legal process that I still think about regularly. She wanted to know whether her grandmother had still loved her, during those final years, or whether that love had somehow been genuinely redirected toward Renee instead. I told her honestly that I believed, and still believe, that my mother's love for both of us never actually changed, but that her capacity to act on that love, to protect it against outside influence, had been slowly, deliberately compromised by someone who understood exactly how to exploit a vulnerable, aging woman's trust and dependency. My son, 21, had a harder time initially even accepting that any of this had happened at all, having remembered his grandmother, in his own more limited final visits with her, as still fundamentally herself, still recognizably the woman who'd shown up to every one of his childhood events with the same warm, specific attention she'd always given him. I think, in some ways, that difficulty reflects exactly how effective this kind of gradual manipulation actually is. It doesn't require completely erasing a person's underlying personality or memory, only redirecting the practical, structural elements of their life and decision-making in ways that can remain invisible even to people who love them deeply and see them regularly, right up until the final, dramatic document reveals just how much had actually shifted beneath the surface. I've spent considerable time since this entire ordeal trying to understand what allowed this specific pattern to work as effectively as it apparently did, across at least two vulnerable elderly people, and I don't think the answer is that either my mother or Harold Whitfield were unusually naive or easily manipulated. I think the answer is that the isolation itself was constructed with genuine skill, one small, individually reasonable redirection at a time, in a way that never once presented a single, clear moment where intervention would have felt obviously justified rather than intrusive or paranoid. I think, often, about the specific cruelty of that single photo album bequest, the one item my mother's final will left explicitly to me. I've gone back and forth, across months of reflection, on how to understand that specific choice, whether it represented some small, remaining fragment of my mother's genuine affection for me surviving within a document otherwise shaped by influence I now understand she likely wasn't fully capable of resisting, or whether it represented something considerably colder, a document crafted with enough awareness to include a token gesture specifically designed to make the whole arrangement seem less suspicious to anyone who might eventually read it. I don't know that I'll ever fully resolve which interpretation is correct, and I've had to make a kind of uneasy peace with living inside that uncertainty rather than forcing it into a cleaner answer than the evidence can actually provide that I opened that photo album, finally, several months into the legal process, something I'd avoided doing for longer than I probably should have, afraid of what looking through it might make me feel. It contained, almost entirely, photographs from my own childhood, school portraits, birthday parties, a specific photo from a family vacation to the coast when I was maybe 8 years old that I'd genuinely forgotten existed until I saw it again. There was nothing of Renee in that album at all, no photos from those final 3 years, nothing documenting the relationship that had ultimately consumed the rest of my mother's estate. I've come to understand that album, in the months since, as containing the version of my mother's life she perhaps still recognized as most fundamentally, permanently true, even if the documents surrounding it no longer reflected that truth in any of its practical, financial terms. What's helped most, in the months since the settlement, has been my ongoing relationship with Patricia Whitfield Moore, two women who never should have had reason to know each other, bound together by having each, years apart, watched the same pattern unfold against a parent we loved. We speak regularly now, comparing notes, supporting each other through a specific, isolating grief that most people who haven't lived through something like this simply can't fully understand, the particular pain of grieving not just a parent's death, but the retroactive loss of understanding what their final years, and their final feelings toward you, actually were. I don't tell this story to suggest that every caregiver who develops a close, meaningful relationship with an elderly client is engaged in some form of exploitation. The overwhelming majority of caregivers are exactly who they present themselves to be, compassionate, skilled professionals who genuinely enrich the final years of the people they care for. What happened to my mother, and to Harold Whitfield before her, was the result of one specific person's deliberate, repeated exploitation of exactly the kind of trust and dependency that legitimate caregiving relationships are built on. If there's something practical I'd ask you to take from this, it's simple, and it's something I wish I'd understood earlier in my own mother's final years. A gradual decrease in your own access to an aging parent, especially one accompanied by an increasingly central caregiver managing that access, deserves gentle, persistent attention, even when each individual redirection sounds entirely reasonable on its own. Ask directly about financial account changes. Request, periodically, independent conversations with your parents' own doctors about their cognitive state. If an estate planning document changes dramatically late in a parent's life, ask, clearly and directly, about the circumstances surrounding that change, rather than assuming, the way I once did, that questioning it would be an unwelcome intrusion into your parents' independence. I got a legal acknowledgement that my mother's final will didn't reflect her genuine wishes. I got a settlement that restored what her actual, long-standing intentions had always been. What I can't fully get back is the last several years of the closeness I once had with my mother, years that were quietly, methodically narrowed by someone who understood, with real skill, exactly how to make that narrowing feel unremarkable while it was happening. I think, often, about Harold Whitfield, a man I never met, whose own family's failed contest years earlier meant Renee learned, refined, and repeated this exact pattern against my mother with what appeared to be considerable confidence that it would work again. I wonder, sometimes, whether earlier, stronger intervention in his case might have spared my own mother entirely from what eventually happened to her. That's not a productive thought to sit with for too long, and I've had to learn, slowly, to acknowledge it without letting it become another source of guilt layered on top of everything else this process has already cost me. If this story affected you, or if you've ever watched your own access to an aging parent slowly change in ways that felt individually reasonable but collectively troubling, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more stories to watch every day.